Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a splendidly interesting and enjoyable new recording of CPE Bach's Sonatas with varied reprises, avec des reprises variées, actually, as they put it back in the day, or mit veranderten Reprisen. We'll talk about that in a minute. Lovingly performed by scholar performer Tom Beghin, who's really a wonderful keyboardist. You may have seen his Naxos cycle of Haydn in its original acoustics, the Haydn Sonata Project, or whatever the thing was called. It was very, very interesting. I mean, he's really an intelligent and lively performer. And this is right up his alley because we get actually two complete sets of the sonatas, one the way they were originally published, and the other the way they were originally published, with even more reprises variées that CPE Bach kept doodling later on in marginalia and whatnot. So we'll talk about that also in a second. But first, we need to deal with two issues. Number one, the packaging. It's one of these things. Oh, God. Two discs, and the booklet here in the middle. And the discs are only extractable from the inner thing, which is good, so they don't fall out at the end. But how do you get to them without destroying the cardboard thing, which is not very strong or flexible, you know? So, well, fortunately, I get to do my demo again. For those of you who may have missed it the first few hundred times around. So let me close this. And, oh gosh, I mean, you can't even, they still like slide around and make it there. All right. You're going to damage something. I mean, it's guaranteed. It really is. Which is terrible. So you're going to get out my handy CD extraction device, which I always keep on hand. There it is. These are all CD extraction devices of various types. You should always have a kit. You should have your kit handy. But this is really, I found, the absolute best. In case you forgot it the first few times, here it is. It's the false eyelash makeup placement device thing that you can buy for, very little money at your, local, whatever you call it, place where you buy cosmetic things, drugstore, whatever. And you go in here. There it is, and you open this thing like that, and you make sure that your CD is in here. Then you bend it down this way. Oh, see? It tears. It tears right there. There's nothing you can do about it to try and get the damn thing out, but then you just extract. That works very well. Then you want to get the essay, which is in the middle thing, which can go either way. But you want to try and find the end where the binding is. And once again, you sort of make a little thing there, hopefully, and you can pull out the booklet. There you go. So the booklet actually contains a rather really interesting but rather prolix and somewhat affected stylistically in literary style essay by Tom Beghin himself, who is doing his own, it seems in the essay, veranderte Reprisen, because he says the same thing a lot, only in different ways. But it's a very interesting essay about, the history of the music and their effect on performance and what they meant for the art of performance. And where did I put oh, here it is. There we go. My kit. So I got to take my kit and put this back. I mean, really a very, very fine piece of writing, if, like I said, a little bit, abstruse, maybe we should say. Anyway, it's okay. So you get really good notes, if long, and two performances of this thing. One, the way Bach wrote it originally and published it, and the other, the way he diddled it later in his life. Now, these 6 sonatas are fascinating. Absolutely fascinating because, like I said, Bach wrote out the repeats and varied them when he did that. Now, not every movement does that. Not every movement has varied repeats. The slow movements, for example, are mostly transitional between first movement and the last movement, and they don't have an independent structure that requires repetition, as, for example, the sonata formish, proto-sonata formish, binary first and last movements. Binary meaning they fall in two halves, both are repeated. Now, within those two halves, usually you hear the principal melodic material at least twice, sometimes more. And at the beginning of what would become later a development section, you'll usually start with the first theme again, which is going to come back when it's recapitulated. So the bottom line is that you hear variations on these themes, well, at least 4, sometimes more times within a movement. And the variations are very extensive. And so you're going to make yourself absolutely crazy if you listen to this stuff thinking, oh, I should listen for the sectional repeat or the return to the beginning and the exposition repeat or the first half repeat. That's not what you hear. What you hear is effectively a through composed series of variations all the way through the movement, from beginning to end. So it starts where it starts and it ends where it ends. And as you're listening, you don't have, as you would in later Viennese classical music, this sense of forward motion all the way through, where you always know where you are in the movement. That wasn't CPE Bach's aesthetic. It's not his aim. His aim is to show you how to vary melodic material. It's very interesting. Bach defined a melody as the surface manifestation of an underlying scheme of harmonies. In other words, that was basically his father's concept as well, in pieces like, for example, the Goldberg variations, where the bass line is the subject of the variations. The variations are everything you can do with a sequence of harmonies in the bass. And that's the way Bach operates in these pieces, more or less, leading up to the final sonata, which is actually a long single movement theme and variations on 2 alternating themes, one in C minor and one in C major, which is a form that, as you probably know, Haydn and Beethoven and people like that would later adopt all the way up to Bruckner and Mahler and those people. Big, long variation movements on 2 alternating themes. And Bach was sort of the guy who got us started in that department with this 6th sonata, which is absolutely marvelous. Now, the instrument in question that Tom Beghin is using, the instrument is a clavichord, and it's his favorite clavichord. It was made by Briggs and Stratton, and it's just an amazing piece, amazing little instrument. It's just charming. In fact, what is a clavichord? For those of you who don't know, a clavichord was a desirable instrument for 2 reasons. Number one is, although it didn't have a huge dynamic range, it had a dynamic range. It was touch sensitive. You could actually sort of see it here. He's lined up in front of it on the front out of the cover here. It's a smallish instrument, and the way it worked is when you pressed a key, a little metal bar or tangent would whack the string, but it would stay on the string as long as you held the key down. So you had to be very careful with how you played it. You could make louder and softer strikes. You had to let go of the key rather quickly in order to obtain the best sound. But if you depressed it and wiggled your finger, you could create Bebung or vibrato. Yes, vibrato was so desirable that they invented instruments that could do them. It was not as loud as a harpsichord, for example, because a harpsichord was a real twang, a real pluck type thing. It was an instrument for small rooms and small spaces where you could commune with the sensitivity of your touch and tone. But because there is a direct connection between the length of time you suppress the key and the kind of sound you can make. I mean, if you push it too hard, you can actually bend the tone and mess up the pitch, which, you have to be very careful when you're playing it. So that has its own performance standard and technique. And I know this because not only have I heard a lot of recordings of the clavichord, but when I was a graduate student in college, I had the most momentous encounter with the instrument. I ran into a lady who wanted to borrow a library book that I had. She was very kind, and she asked to come over and have a look at it because I was using it for my second master's thesis at the time. And she showed up, and we were talking about something, and we got to talking about early music because she said that she was majoring. This is at Stanford. She was in the music department. She was majoring in pre and post tonal music. To which my response is, in other words, you're ignoring all the kinds of music that people want to hear, right? Well, in actuality, she wasn't really trying to become a scholar. She was trying to find a husband. And so, if you're shopping for a husband, you can major in pre and post tonal music. It doesn't really make any difference. But anyway, so we were talking about early instruments, and she said, why don't you come on over to my place and check out my clavichord? Which I think was like the most fabulous pickup line I'd ever heard in my life. How could I resist? So I said, sure, I'd love to check out your clavichord. And she had one. Really. Turns out her sister had a hobby building clavichords. To which my response is, boy, you must have like fun family get-togethers. That must be something on Thanksgiving or whatnot. But anyway, she had a clavichord. So I got to play around with the clavichord, and it was really a very, very, very interesting experience for me. I mean, it wasn't a Briggs and Stratton model like Tom Beghin here has, but it was quite something. And you really do understand that it's a different kind of instrument. I mean, the first movement of the third sonata here is a presto. And it's amazing how virtuosic you could be on this thing with a limited keyboard and where you have to be really touch sensitive. He plays it amazingly. Generally speaking, tempos are going to be a little bit slower than normal because you can vary the sound to such a degree, and you want to give the notes the time to speak, so that you can hear what's going on and you can hear the differences in dynamics and attack and touch. It's a very different kind of sound. In fact, wait a minute, I don't have a clavichord here, but I do have something that's kind of similar. Believe it or not, it's a simulacrum of a clavichord. Yes, here I have a kalimba. You've seen these things, right? These thumb drums or whatever they're called. They're called kalimbas, African thumb or thing. And you just do this with your thumb, right? It's sort of like that. It's actually a little even drier sounding than this thing. But that's kind of what they're like. I mean, they're limited in some ways, but actually rather lovely in others. And you have to really take your time and get into the music while you're listening. It's a very different listening experience than playing a harpsichord or a piano or a kalimba or any of those things. Let me put this little sucker back. There we go. And Beghin is a master. I mean, at the instrument, he has a lovely sounding instrument. If you compare these performances to versions on the piano, like with Anna Maria Markovina, the cycle on Hensler, which is fabulous, of all the keyboard music by CPE Bach, you'll hear the differences immediately. They sound almost like different works. Not least because the piano permits a genuine singing legato, which is much, much harder to achieve on the clavichord. Which isn't to say that you can't play legato, but as often as not, there's a lot of very short, sharp rhythms and attacks going on here. But fortunately, the instrument itself allows you to hear the actual notes, even in a really sharp staccato, because you hear harpsichords where sometimes they just go like this, and you don't even know what notes are being played. You never have this problem here. I mean, Beghin makes sure that you hear everything. The sonics are wonderful. Now, the only other question is, do you really need 2 complete sets of these sonatas? They are actually priced reasonably for that. It's like 2 for the price of 1 or something, so you get both of them. My personal feeling about having the extra super duper varied reprises is that they tell us virtually nothing, because you don't hear them until you know the music really, really well, unless you're the player. I mean, these things, they were written for the player rather than the listener, to understand how to vary a melody. How to perform music in which you may be called upon to vary a melody and improvise yourself. I mean, that's what CPE Bach had in mind. And like I said, you're going to hear movements that seem as though they're through composed. You may recognize the variations when they return, you may not. And so to hear yet more of them, including slow movements where there were no reprises to begin with, so you're only hearing a varied version rather than a reprised version of a varied version. I really feel as though it's interesting for scholars, but not so much for listeners. And that may be part of his intent too. I mean, that's perfectly legitimate because it's the same price either way. You can play either version. You don't have to listen to either of them. The real issue that he doesn't deal with, that I really think is important, and which is the sort of the elephant in the room when it comes to this whole concept, is what do these variations mean? You know, one of the reasons that variations exist, theoretically, ornamentation exists, is to enhance the expressive meaning of the melodies and underlying harmonies. In other words, to make the music more expressive. So what does it express? And how by doing this do we get more expressive rather than less? That remains completely unanswered because I have to say, the music sounds the way it sounds. Does one variation make you more sad or more happy or more whatever than another? I don't hear it. I love the music. The music is wonderful. But the character, the overall character of the music, remains pretty much the way it is, whether it's varied or not varied, I think. I may be wrong. There may be other ways of looking at it, and it may be that the more you listen, the more these small details or large details in changing the melodic shape make a difference to your experience of the music emotionally. But even in his long and extensive essay, Mr. Beghin does not begin to address that question, which I really think is the most meaningful one. And that, quite frankly, is a question that every individual listener will have to decide for themselves, because I don't know if there is an answer to that question. All I can tell you is that these are very, very fine performances, very interesting performances, thoroughly scholarly performances of some really fantastic keyboard music that most people may not know. And listening to them on the clavichord will be quite the experience, quite a different listening experience for most. So keep on listening, friends. Oh, let me tell you the label. Wait a minute. It's on this Evil Penguin Classic. There, wasn't that important? Yes, Evil Penguin. Just remember that. And keep on listening. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.